Hello everyone, I'm Salim Kikeke. Welcome to Focus on Africa. Our top stories. Egypt's former President Hosni Mubarak has died in hospital in Cairo. He was 91. A statesman of war and peace, he was feted abroad but ousted by his own people in 2011 uprising. Sterilized against their will, a report says dozens of HIV-positive women in South Africa were pressured to agree to the procedure just before giving birth. Also in the program, deliberately disconnected, claims that internet blackouts are becoming a defining tool of government repression. We look at the extent of the problem across Africa. And in sports, more Champions League last 16 ties with a repeat of the 2012 final as Chelsea host German champions Bayern Munich. Thank you for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. Egypt's former President Hosni Mubarak has died. He was 91. He ruled the country for 3 decades before he was forced from office in a mass uprising in 2011. He was tried and found guilty of complicity in the killing of protesters, but was later acquitted. Mr. Mubarak was a hugely influential figure in the region during his years in power. His family said he died at a military hospital in Cairo. Nidal Abumirad reports.
He was in power for 30 years, but it was the last 3 weeks of Hosni Mubarak's rule which will always be remembered. His downfall after an eruption of public anger. Back in 1981, following the assassination of President Sadat by Islamist militants, Vice President Hosni Mubarak became the latest military man to rule Egypt. His absolute priority, stability. President Mubarak was always a loyal ally for the West, maintaining the peace treaty with Israel and confronting Islamic extremism. But at home, he presided over increasing economic and political stagnation. His government gained a notorious reputation for corruption and the abuse of human rights.
He was impervious to the feelings of the people. And he seemed to look down on them, to look down on their aspirations, to look down on their hopes. He was surrounded by mediocrity, and he always gave preference to those in whom he can guarantee their loyalty and not necessarily their merit.
On January the 25th, 2011, Egyptians flooded into Tahrir Square. This time, the tear gas and water cannon was powerless to protect the regime. In a series of television addresses, Hosni Mubarak mixed concessions with condescension and defiance.
I give my pledge and commitment to carry out my responsibilities to protect the Constitution and the interests of the people until responsibility is handed to whoever is elected by the electorate next September in free and fair elections, guaranteed by transparency and freedom.
On one pivotal day, regime supporters on camels and horses charged protesters in Tahrir Square. Mystery gunmen carried on the attack through the night. But finally, Egypt's military turned against him, and one of Hosni Mubarak's most loyal lieutenants, then Army General Omar Suleiman, announced his overthrow. Much of Egypt erupted with joy. Huge crowds taken to the streets to welcome a new, if uncertain, era. Within months, the ailing former leader had been wheeled into court on a stretcher. After a long trial, he was sentenced to life in prison for ordering the killing of protesters. Eventually, that conviction was overturned and he was freed in March 2017. For the United States and Israel, President Hosni Mubarak had proved a key ally. It was not that which brought him down, but a stunning lack of vision in the way he ran the country at home. The day he was finally forced from office, the huge crowds that came out to celebrate served as a damning verdict on his 3 decades in power. Nidal Abumirad, BBC News.
Well, Salih Nabil from BBC Arabic joins me now from Cairo. Salih, what's been the reaction in Egypt? He was quite a divisive figure, wasn't he?
He was absolutely a very divisive figure, and we've been getting mixed reactions since the news of has been confirmed. Those who took part in the 2011 revolution that ousted President Mubarak, former President Mubarak, from power, still see him as a corrupt dictator who deserved to be ousted, who deserved to stand trial. They hold him responsible for the poverty millions of Egyptians suffered from, for killing hundreds of protesters during the 2011 uprising. And they say that this man deserved the fate he got when he was removed following angry protests in the streets. But on the other hand, we have some people who believe that his biggest virtue was stability, that he kept the country stable for nearly 3 decades. Others set some sort of a comparison between Mubarak's days and nowadays, and they believe that Egypt was a better country under his rule because although he was an autocrat, he still allowed some space for freedom of speech, whereas the current president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, seems to be cracking down on all forms of opposition, whether secular or Islamist.
Sally, do we have any details about his funeral?
What we understand so far, according to sources, is that a military funeral will be held tomorrow for the former president. Current President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi might take part. This is yet to be confirmed. Also, we know that delegates from neighboring Arab countries will be attending. And in fact, the way the honorable farewell that he will be given tomorrow, this might bring about a lot of grief and sadness in the hearts of the families of the protesters who lost their lives in 2011, calling on Mubarak to go, because they will see the man who they hold responsible for killing their loved ones being paid a very good and honorable farewell.
Many thanks, Sally Nabil there in Cairo. Let's talk more about Hosni Mubarak's legacy in the region and on the continent. We can now speak to Timothy Kaldas of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy in Cairo. Thank you so much for joining us. How does Sub-Saharan Africa view the contribution, Mr. Mubarak's contribution to the continent during his time as president and after?
Well, I think that in his waning years, the relationship between Cairo and its southern neighbors was not as much of a priority as it probably should have been, and we saw the consequences of that following his overthrow, where Egypt struggled to drum up support for its position with respect to the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and has been trying to rebuild its position in Africa during Sisi's presidency, where they presided over the presidency of the African Union until recently. But there has been, generally speaking, he focused more on his relationships with the West and with his allies in the Gulf and throughout the region, throughout the Middle East rather, and didn't really emphasize relations with the African continent. Even here in Egypt has actually one of the montages they did was criticizing him for weakening Egypt's position in Africa.
Why was that? Why was he not, interested in making relations with Sub-Saharan Africa?
I think from the perspective of Egypt, a lot of its foreign relations are driven by rent-seeking and trying to achieve a level of strategic consequence to foreign powers that allows it to solicit international assistance and grants, as well as be seen as indispensable allies. And so the areas where Mubarak felt that he could achieve that most effectively would be as a mediator, for example, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as his participation in the '91 Gulf War, which successfully got Egypt a waiver on much of its external debt, which was a huge help in stabilizing the economy. I think that's where he saw his strength. And he also was, of course, inherited a situation in which Egypt had been kicked out of the Arab League, and he had to rebuild that relationship with his allies in the Arab world in order to reestablish Egypt as not only a member of the Arab League, but also as the host of the Arab League, which sits actually on Tahrir Square.
Before '95, he made an effort to attend most African Union meetings. What was he trying to achieve by keeping in touch with the continent that he sort of really didn't care about?
Well, I think that I wouldn't go so far as he didn't care, but I think fundamentally Egypt's most central interest when it comes to its relations with neighbors to the south of it is its access to Nile water. A lot of the riparian states, the states that are the sources of the Nile waters, do not accept Egypt's claims to all of the Nile water alongside Sudan. And also Egypt's claim to have veto power over any of their efforts to develop use of that resource, whether it be through irrigation or through building dams that would allow them to create hydropower. And this has been a point of contention for an extremely long time. Egypt's claims are based on treaties that were promulgated in 1929 and 59. And a lot of other states on the continent in the Nile Basin view that as a colonial era set of agreements that they don't have to respect.
Many thanks, Timothy Caldas, in Cairo. Let's take a quick look at other stories making the headlines across Africa and the rest of the world. A law's been passed in Malawi, setting a date for the rerun of last May's elections. They will now be held on the 19th of May. It follows an unprecedented ruling by the Constitutional Court earlier this month, annulling the original results, citing widespread irregularities. The poll became known as Tipex elections because of the use of correction fluid to alter tally sheets. There have been protests in Cameroon over remarks made by the French president. Crowds gathered outside the French embassy in the capital, Yaoundé, after a video emerged of Emmanuel Macron telling a Cameroonian activist in Paris that there were intolerable human rights violations in the country. Mr. Macron also said he'd pressured Cameroon's President Paul Biya to release an opposition leader who'd been in prison. Now, dozens of women in South Africa say they were coerced into being sterilized. That's according to a report by the Commission for Gender Equality, which says the women who were HIV positive were sterilized without consent or after being pressured to agree just before giving birth. It happened in 15 hospitals in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng between 2002 and 2015. Some women say they were coerced into signing the forms while they were in labor and were told they would not receive medical assistance until they had signed them. Authorities say it's not government's policy to carry out such sterilizations. The health minister has acknowledged findings but not responded. The health department has 3 months to respond to the findings. Joining me from Johannesburg is Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng from the Commission for Gender Equality. Thank you so much for your time. Can you give us more details about the claims in this report?
In March 2015, the Commission for Gender Equality received 48 affidavits of women who detailed what their experience was in the public health system during labor. All of them are HIV positive, and they do detail a very subjective experience and a very harrowing, violent experience of what the situation was when consent was sought for them to sterilize. None of these women, in fact, since laying the bringing the affidavits to the commission, have received any satisfactory response from the provincial or the national departments of health, and some of their cases are already prescribed in law. Hence, they came to the commission in seeking justice, and I suppose a wider call for justice for all the women who have been subject to these sterilizations in the public health system.
Do we know anything about why these sterilizations took place?
Well, we know two things. Firstly, that the United Nations Special Rapporteur describes forced or coerced sterilization as a form of cruelty, torture, and it's inhumane. And secondly, during the investigations and the site visits that the Commission undertook in this period from 2015 in March, is that some of the hospitals' medical records have gone missing. So we actually couldn't find and see objectively what happened to some of the patients. Some of the women in this group that complained of 48, there isn't enough evidence in paper that's there in their records to suggest that informed consent was facilitated. In fact, some of the paperwork is half-filled and incomplete, and it actually falls beyond the measures of informed consent. If you bring the other layer of discrimination based on HIV status, you will get a different, nuanced understanding of the issue. Is it not only were women forced or coerced into sterilization, they were further discriminated against because they were HIV positive. And this is based on the commentary and a lot of what the women recall as having been some of the reasons that they were sterilized.
What has been the reaction to these, reaction from the authorities from the claims?
I think it must be noted, and it's worth talking about the fact that the Commission did, notify the departments when they received this complaint back in 2015. At that time, and in some various points in time, we were not getting consistent partnership with them to fix this problem or to at least investigate. In the different provinces and sites, there were, reports from the Commission staff and the legal team that, in fact, some of the hospital staff were deliberately being obstructive and withholding information required. Up to the day of the launch, which was Monday this week, we had not received, in our view, a satisfactory engagement with the Department of Health, both national and provincial. And I suppose it does speak to a bigger issue of accountability and the fact that this big public health issue has been left, since 2015 without even the department's own resources being used to quantify and look at the prevalence of this issue despite being notified of these complaints.
Many thanks, Dr. Tialeng Mofokeng. We're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanks a lot. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News with me, Salim. Kikeke. Still to come in sport, Egyptian side Zamalek failed to turn up at the Cairo derby and could face punishment as rivals Al Ahly are left standing alone on the pitch. Welcome back. This is Focus on Africa with me, Salim Kikeke. Now, online freedom is a human right, so says the United Nations. But human rights groups say that internet shutdowns are becoming a defining tool of state repression. It's an issue that particularly affects Africans. Most of us use mobile phones connected to the internet as our primary source of information and organization. But in 2018 alone, the internet was shut down 21 times across the continent, often during protests. The BBC's Joe Tidy takes a look at the problem.
The internet has revolutionised democracy by giving every phone, every computer a more equal chance to speak and share information. And during any big event, whether a celebration or a crisis, many of us look to social media as our primary source of news. However, this network, which is built around bringing us closer together, is now under threat. Human rights groups say turning off the internet is now becoming a defining tool of government repression around the world. Using the very latest data, this video will reveal the true scale of the internet blackouts around the world and show how and when the plug is pulled. Take a look at this map. As we move through 2019, watch as the internet is turned off more than 200 times in more than 30 countries. Sometimes an entire nation will be switched off, but often it's localised to a city or a region. And our analysis shows these blackouts often occur during times of political instability or civil unrest. Governments often say it's to help ensure public safety and stop the spread of fake news. But critics say the shutdowns stifle the flow of information online and crack down on any potential dissent offline. The data shows that in 2019, the internet was switched off during more than 60 protests and during a dozen elections. So just how do governments shut down the internet? When authorities order a blackout, internet service providers are told to pull the plug on all social platforms such as WhatsApp, Twitter and Telegram. Last year, the Central African nation of Chad endured one of the longest shutdowns on record. The president ordered a nationwide blackout for more than 15 months. Much harder to monitor, though, is when governments throttle the connection. By slowing it down from 3, 4 or 5G down to 2G, it becomes impossible to share videos or live stream. Last May, the president of Tajikistan admitted to throttling all Google platforms, as well as Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, saying they were vulnerable to terrorist activity. However, nowhere experiences more shutdowns than India. In 2019, Indians experienced over 100 blackouts. Hardest hit by far was Kashmir, where mobile internet services were suspended for more than half the year. With millions of people affected, forced off social media, deprived of news, and restricted in their means to contact their loved ones, Kashmiris say the shutdown has been devastating. India says the move was necessary to maintain law and order, but economically it has been crippling, with many local businesses being run into the ground. Around the world, the most common reason for governments to shut down the internet is in the interest of public safety. Then they pull the plug. With state-ordered shutdowns on the rise, the internet, a revolution which was built to bring us closer together, is under threat.
Joe Tidy, BBC News.
You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. It's now time for some sport with Mimi Fawaz. Mimi.
Thank you, Salim. Champions League action today. 2 last 16 first leg ties kicking off in just over 2 hours' time. Napoli will host Barcelona. And the other game sees Chelsea, who are facing Bayern Munich at Stamford Bridge, in a repeat of the 2012 final where the Blues lifted the trophy for the first time against the Bundesliga giants. Bayern will have their forward Serge Gnabry, who is of German and Ivorian heritage. The former Arsenal man scored 4 goals in their 7-2 win over Spurs in the group stage in London back in October. He'll be hoping that he can repeat that. BBC Sport went to speak to him.
All that I want, and I want to feel the heat.
As a 10-year-old, I was obviously crying not being able to join Bayern because your father says no. Obviously I wanted to. It was back then already the best club, but yeah, it took me another 12, 13 years to come back here, but I'm glad how it turned out, and also the route that I've taken, I think, made me what I am and who I am today.
Go.
Very exciting for sure in the beginning, quite anxious as well because it was such a big world to get into. The cultural effect, I think, helped me a lot, and maturity-wise, I've taken a lot with me from my time in London. And yeah, as a 16-year-old boy, to leave your parents, or I would say leave your surroundings, makes you grow a bit faster, I think. I knew that I needed to play again at a high level, so I thought, okay, let me take a chance on that. Let me go back, because I didn't see a lot of game time at Arsenal the next season. And that were the key factors why I chose to go back to Germany. Yeah. I didn't expect to come back to North London and then score 4 goals. Yeah, it was a special night for me, special night for the team. I think one of the highest wins ever. So yeah, hopefully Chelsea could be a similar scenario. That would be good for us.
All right, top-flight Egyptian side Zamalek faced punishment after failing to turn up to the Cairo derby against rivals Al Ahly on Monday. It comes after sanctions were handed to players and officials from both clubs following a brawl when the teams met in last week's Egyptian Super Cup. Zamalek say they intended to play but had been delayed in traffic. But the Egyptian Football Association said there were no obstacles holding up the team bus and say it will take disciplinary action. Moving on, Zimbabwe has been banned from hosting any international matches until further notice. It comes after the Confederation of African Football ruled that none of the country's stadiums meet the required standards to host international games. Zimbabwe had been set to host Algeria in the key 2021 Africa Cup of Nations qualifier in Harare next month, but they must now find a neutral venue. That's all the sports, Salim.
Many thanks, Mimi. Well, don't forget you can get in touch with me and some of the team on social media. I'm at Salim. Well, that's all from the program. From me, Salim Kikeke, and the rest of the Focus on Africa team. Goodbye.